Thank you very much. It's great to be back here. It's been a long time since I talked to the RAS, and it's good to see you all again. I'm glad you made it tonight. Okay, we're going to talk about distinctive characteristics of Korean Buddhism. This is not at all the final word on this subject, but kind of an exploration, an opening of the topics with various questions which we will just partially answer. What is really Korean about Korean Buddhism? What's the really Korean aspects of it that we can pick out and say are different enough from other Buddhist countries, in particular the close neighbors, China, Mongolia, Japan, especially. It's pretty easy to find big differences with Southeast Asia or India and Sri Lanka. Okay, but then what is, with our fellow Northeast Asian Mahayana, what is really different? Our works, beliefs, practices, the whole mood of it. What's different? And first of all, why do we even ask this? Who cares? Well, some people do. And there are various reasons for getting into this question, but it's good to be explicit and upfront about those right at the beginning. The religious identity of Korean Buddhism itself, it matters to the Korean Buddhists. In their publications, they talk about their unique aspects, what they call unique, or at least what is distinctive, and some of that I agree with, and some of it I disagree with what they say, the national order here, I mean the Jogye order. They care about this. They want to seem as a member of international Buddhism, but at the same time distinctively Korean for their own purpose of having their own identity. Many Koreans who are not even Buddhists are also interested in this idea of a national identity and how Korea is distinctly different from China and Japan. And, you know, you can bring up the kimchi, the garlic, the taekwondo, you know, the easy stuff, and the government frequently does. And this gets into national ethnic identity questions, which is actually a very strong concern here. As you've seen, there's a lot of discussion of it, of just who are the Koreans and how are they different. And often they like to emphasize the differences from their neighbors and itself as a distinct separate nation, and in history trying to roll that back many, many centuries as having a separate and distinct national identity. That's pretty a strong concern here already. And that involves the questions of North Korea and unification, because this idea there's these two different Korean countries, and a casual observer might say, well, so what? Why not have two different governments that are Korean, the same basic ethnicity, but different countries? Lots of other peoples around the world have that situation. There's nothing so bad about it, but the Koreans tend to be rather vehement that they are one people, one culture, one ethnicity, and therefore should be one country. And then reasons for that get into these questions of cultural ethnic identity. And because all of Korea, for about half of what we could call Korean history, from the very beginning of a real civilization, Korea was Buddhist. And it has, through most of its civilized history, had a very strong component of Buddhism in it. And so the question of the distinctiveness of Korean Buddhism is significant to this whole idea of national unified identity, if there really is one. And tourism and other practical applications. The government uses stuff like this for promotion of Korean culture. The government, as you know, the Ministry of Culture has their own particular listings of what are distinctively Korean things that no other country has, or that really signify Korea. And again, I have lots of disagreements with that list, but they use that. And for tourism, which is actually my field of cultural tourism, what I work in, and we love the distinctly Korean stuff, the uniquely Korean stuff, and we play it up, we exaggerate it for the tourism business. Quite different. All the time I'm talking with scholars, like historical scholars, who want to be very sober and say, well, you know, that's not really the way it happened, or that's just a myth, or that's not really a Korean characteristic, and Japan does the same thing. But we in tourism, we always say, hey, shut up, shut up, shut up. We don't want to hear none of that. This is really Korean. It's the flavor of Korea. The tourism business, we're more concerned with promotion than with accuracy, perhaps, as far as a scholarly field. But what is the value in promoting them? It's sort of an open question. And they say, what do we get for identifying and then even promoting, and within the Buddhist orders themselves and within the tourism programs like the TempleStay program and other related tourism efforts that involve Buddhism, what do we get out of, say, perhaps exaggerating these, or at least pointing out and promoting these? And by pointing them out and promoting them, by showing these things that are distinctively Korean, do we perhaps promote their exaggeration? Will that prompt the Buddhists to play those things up even more at their temples, or perhaps even get into an artificial exaggeration of these characteristics? And I don't know if it will, but it's a question worth considering as we go here. Okay. Some points to make, just cautions or setting some ground rules in the beginning. There's no universal or pure Buddhism. There's no such thing as an international just Buddhism itself. Every Buddhism there is by some kind of nation, some national tradition that comes up. And the Buddhism that's today in India is no more, authentic or real or pure in some way than some Japanese sect of Buddhism. It's all there, but there is some kind of imagination of this. People within the National Buddhist Order do talk about, how we should be more on an international standard of Buddhism and purify ourselves. Some people say this, just be Buddhist and get rid of these Korean aspects, especially the folk culture aspects. Some people do talk like this and kind of imagine this, but there really isn't any. Part of this comes from criticism from Christians during the 20th century, because there is, as we're going to get to the first point here, a lot of Taoism and folk culture and shamanism blended in with Korean Buddhism. Christians have always pointed at that and said, well, you see, Buddhism is just a kind of shamanism. They're just blended together. It's not a real religion, sort of a devil worship thing. And in reaction to that, some Buddhists, most particularly the very famous great master of the 20th century, Songchul Sanim, one of our greatest, got really heated about getting rid of those distinctively Korean aspects and trying to become a international Buddhism, a real standardized Buddhism and such, to try to escape from this criticism by the Christians. And that whole thing was a bit of a failure in an attempt, but probably it should not be ever attempted. There is no such thing as a universal international Buddhism. Okay. Now, none of these characteristics I'm going to talk about are unique. Using that word, people abuse that word a lot these days. It's used too much. Unique really means there is no other such thing. Probably everything I mentioned here, you can find some aspect of in China or in Japan, and sometimes a fairly strong aspect, or in other Buddhist countries, or with other even religions and such. You can find something. None of this is completely separately distinct, but these are trends that are more noticeable in Korean Buddhism for some reason, for some certain historical reason. It's more in Korean Buddhism than in other places, that I think enough to make it a distinctive characteristic. Okay. And plenty of mutual influence always through history. This is incredibly complicated, how these other countries have influenced Korea, and Korea has influenced them. A lot of what's happened in Korean Buddhism has gone back to China, and of course a lot of it's gone to Japan, and Korea was the most major influence on Japanese Buddhism and such. And they've all influenced each other, and so therefore you can't draw these simple borderlines of distinctions. And now still, however, I think some national characteristics can be found and identified and talked about, which is what I'm going to try to do here tonight. We've got 8 of them that I have picked out. And these are the 8 that I want to talk through and run through. 8 distinctive factors or trends that really do kind of characterize Korean Buddhism and make it Korean that we can talk about. We'll go through these one by one. Any one of these we could spend an entire 1-hour lecture on, obviously. So I'm kind of introducing. Maybe I'll come back and do 8 more lectures. Yeah, right. We'll sort of get one of these in rigorously, but we just kind of introduce. And in particular, this first topic, the nature-focused influence from Shamanism and Taoism within Korean Buddhism, and this includes the mountain spirit, which is my personal favorite subject. And those of you who know me know that I could start talking about the mountain spirit and go right to midnight without pausing for a drink of water and such, and I will spare you from that. And I'll try to make it a rather brief mention. But now what happened with it? Shamanism, this early shamanism all over Northeast Asia, the kind of original folk culture before these major religions, as we call them, the Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, were imported or were organized here. The shamanism, the folk culture, by just historical process, things went different in the different countries. Shamanism in China evolved into what we call Taoism, partially, but very much richly. The Chinese village folk spiritual culture got a philosophy laid over on top of it, and then inspired by the Buddhists, got organized into kind of a religion with temples and monks and official documents and philosophy and such, but still incorporate a lot of just the old village shamanism and a very nature-oriented, very body-oriented, compared to Buddhism. Buddhism mostly concerned with the mind and psychological process, being from India, where they really think more this way. Taoism in China, much more body-oriented about the circulations of energy within the body and the earthly energy, heavenly energy, the way that that interacts with human energy. This sort of more physical, less psychological views. This organized into a whole separate religion in China, Taoism. And as Buddhism grew up in China, it got into competition with Taoism. And then there was the Confucians too, and later, especially when you get Neo-Confucianism, you got really 3 separate, distinct religions that are competitive with each other. And while they shared certain characteristics, and they all shared a root in the I Ching, the symbols that are on the South Korean flag, that are from the I Ching, that are from the kind of root philosophy of all of them, but still, 3 different religious institutions with monks and temples and budgets and organizations that were competitive, and they kept separate from each other. They had distinctly Taoist doctrines and practices, and the Buddhists would reject all of that, and the Buddhists had their own practices, doctrines, icons, the spirits and gods they worship. They were kept pretty distinctly separate and different because they were competitive different religions, like the Christians and Islam or something in a competitive sense. Now, that didn't happen in Korea. Also in Japan, the native shamanism in Japan also got organized slowly, step by step, into what we now call Shinto, and a whole conglomeration of practices, but got pretty institutionalized. And in Japan, it ended up not really as a separate religion, but as a government-supported and government-supporting thing, especially climaxing in the early 20th century, but more as an organized, different religious thing that stayed distinctly separate from Buddhism. Neither of these ever happened in Korea. In Korea, the native indigenous shamanism remained as native shamanism. Buddhism supplanted it, but the shamanism never organized into a religious organization. Never became like Taoism or Shinto in those countries. And then Chinese Taoism came into Korea, was brought in at the same time with Buddhism, along at the same time. It flowed in on the early Confucianism, but yet never got organized. It was never really a religion. Didn't set up temples and an organization. So it wasn't a competitive thing. Korean Buddhists then tended to adopt the shamanism and Taoism aspects into Korean Buddhism. Now, this makes Korean Buddhism a really distinct and different flavor from what it is in those other countries. In China, you got, for example, the geomancy. Geomancy, or what in Korea we call feng sujiri. In Chinese feng shui. That's a distinctively Taoist art, and it's practiced by Taoists in China, mostly all by Taoist practitioners, and it's considered part of the Taoist religion and such. Here in Korea, the most famous feng sujiri experts we've had in Korea have been Buddhist monks. And still today, a fair amount of Buddhist monks practice geomancy. Other Confucian types also did later when Neo-Confucianism was dominant in the last few centuries, but for the first 1,000 years, mainly practiced by Buddhists. They just incorporated it within the Buddhism. They didn't care that it was originally Taoist. Still today, many Korean Buddhist monks, masters, they study Taoist classics, something you would not find in China, where it's considered, that's a different religion, it's a different tradition. It's a whole thing. I've had great Korean Buddhist masters, I've had them tell me, kind of quietly, a little on the side, saying, oh, it's the same wisdom, same truth. The Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, something like that. Just as good as the teachings of the Buddha. As I did, right there. Now, this is something that I have found very attractive about Korean Buddhism. This is something I always focused on. Ever since I came here, I noticed that. I liked Chinese Taoism a lot, and I also liked Buddhism. And when I came to Korea, and I found that the Taoism was very much integrated into the Buddhism, I thought, well, great, one package. Wonderful. It's perfectly for me. So again, an attractive aspect. This is a painting on a very famous Buddhist temple, Tongdo-sa, one of the great temples, of an immortal spirit as a young boy flying on a dragon up to heaven. That has nothing at all to do with Buddhist doctrines, any such thing. It's very Taoist and kind of shamanistic. And many Buddhist temples you can find like this, paintings of immortals, Taoist immortals, what Koreans call shinsun. They have hair on their heads, so they're not monks. Not Buddhist monks, but they're Taoist immortals, but they're painted on certain types of Buddhist buildings here, and with the long eyebrow motif and such, which is sometimes used for one of the Buddhist arhats, but also used for immortals of Chinese Taoism, guys like this. And it's these traditions that are very nature-focused and body-focused are then found within I don't know what's going wrong here. Hold on. All right. How do you get the full screen?
Shift F5.
No, shift F7, I think. Yeah. No?
Maybe function shift F7.
Yeah, function. Function F7.
Technology. This is very much like a mountain spirit icon, in fact, like a Sanjin icon, but it's a Buddhist master there with the tiger in the context of the great wild rough mountains. This has nothing at all to do with classical Buddhist art. No precedent. This is inside a Buddhist shrine. These are really quite Taoist immortal sort of figures and their interaction with the beings of nature. They go along with it. Again, something that's very much like a mountain spirit and very Taoist in character, but with a Buddhist incense burner and a boy bringing ginseng root. Very Taoist sort of thing. Much like the Taoist Eight Immortals kind of theme that you find in China all the time. The wise sages here, 7 sages around the thing, on a cliff within a Buddhist temple. And Buddhist monks who have a very Taoist sort of aspect to them as they retreat in the mountains. Things like this, being with the deer while he's studying the sutra and such, or having a little nap with the tiger. That are then blended in, or here again, a half-bald one, and with a Buddhist master's fly whisk as one of the symbols of a Buddhist Zen master in formal paintings, and he is flying on a white crane, a heavenly flight. a very Taoist theme, and the great fish on the ocean and such. Within most Korean Buddhist temples, a very popular figure, the Dokson, with the lonely saint, who is, there should be a whole lecture in itself also, one of the Buddhist arhats who lives here on earth. Out of the 18 original arhats, meaning the primary disciples of Sakyamuni Buddha, 18 of them, one of them, having committed mistakes and abusing his powers, is sentenced by Buddha to live here on earth until the next Buddha comes. So he becomes such an old ancient man and such, and he can help human beings with his magical powers. This is very shamanistic, it's very folk culturistic. People pray for real-world shamanic benefits to this figure, and he's very popular. He's found in most Buddhist temples. He is technically a Buddhist deity, but with extremely Taoist and shamanistic aspects, including the very natural, rich nature context he's always in, which is in symbols of fecundity, fertility, and such here that are often found in mountain spirit paintings that he also shares here with the master's fly, which is very elaborate, but otherwise in a very mountain spiritish kind of context. Okay, here with the Taoist, distinctly the golden peaches of immortality, a very strong Chinese Taoist theme, the idea of these peaches, that if you can eat one of them, you can become a spirit immortal, extremely Taoist. Well, here it is with this Buddhist saint in the painting, a blend, a rich blend of cultural things. And here is various Buddhist motifs with the Taoist and shamanic motifs in these paintings. And here, even a little Korean folk art, a little humor here, his extremely long eyebrows draped over his staff, and with the bird, thinking at it as if the bird has found a worm. A little bit of folk humor from the old Korean folk paintings, tiger paintings and such, in this otherwise very serious Buddhist saint figure of worship. You would not find that in other countries. Especially now, the Shinjung Tenghwa is present in other Mahayana Buddhist countries, but has a really prominent position here in Korea, that in every temple and in the main hall of the temple, and is one of the major objects of worship, second only to the statues of Buddha on the main altar itself, this collection of spirits who originally from the Hindu religion and worked their way into the Mahayana Buddhist scriptures, but picked up a lot from Chinese Taoism and even from shamanism figures, including right there Korea's Sanjin mountain spirit. You see him standing right up front and center with his basket of herbs and such within this. And this collection of, ultimately, if there's enough space, 108 of these spirits is in the main hall of every Buddhist temple, and is extremely important in their beliefs and practices. Now finally, the mountain spirit shrine, and again, my specialty subject in particular, but a distinctively Taoist and shamanic figure who has never acquired any Buddhist characteristics, has never been taken over by the Buddhists, never conquered by Buddhism in 1,500 years, but still is in every Buddhist temple. And this is the first thing that really puzzled and fascinated me when the very first time I visited a major Korean Buddhist temple, and I was already familiar with Buddhist art, and could see all the Buddhist art and such, and found one of these shrines here for a mountain spirit, and looking at the artwork, finding that it's distinctively Taoist. And his artwork, saying, what the heck is this? Why is there a Taoist shrine in a Buddhist temple? And monks were going in there chanting and praying to this figure in the evening. And why would they do so? But one of these shrines is in probably 90% of Korean Buddhist temples, shrine to the mountain spirit. Okay. Now, there has been a transition, a changing recently from the old mountain spirit shrines, and here you have a real old one with grass sprouting on it, falling apart, and then the new Samsonggak, the three sages shrines that these are replacing this, that the mountain spirit is teamed up with two other folk shamanic spirits in this triplet shrine. Do I get a cup of water? I think it would be a good idea. Before we go too far here. Okay, Samsungak shrines, which are replacing the old Sanchin gods with 3 spirits in them. The mountain spirit, the lonely saint, who I've already introduced, and the Chilsung. Here they are. The lonely saint, who is Buddhist, but with very shamanic Taoist characteristics. In the center, the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, called the Chilsung, which is definitely a Chinese Taoist deity, imported in here, worshipped very much in Chinese Taoism, brought into Korea, adopted by Korean shamanism, but then also by Buddhists, and the Buddhists started making them as 7 Buddhas. This one in the center doesn't count, but these 7 up here with the halos are the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. And this guy over here is the North Star. This is a icon of longevity and also fertility, fecundity, kind of ideas and such, but painted in a Buddhist way. And then the mountain spirit himself is, as I said, this is a very standard, typical kind of mountain spirit painting, distinctively Taoist and really nothing Buddhist about him, but he's in every Buddhist temple. And you will not find this in China, or very rarely, and you won't find it in Japan. Something that is very Korean about Korean Buddhism. This figure in particular, the mountain spirit, has a lot of associations also with national identity. This leaf mantle, such as echoes of Dangun, the first king of the first Korean state in mythology, and the white tiger with him and such as great symbols of Korea's nationalistic spirit. And what was I going to say? Has never become really a Buddhist figure. Right? Examples like this showing the folk art aspects of the mountain spirit, including a rather ridiculous tiger paintings and the mountain spirit standing independently within one of these collection of spirits, the Shinju Tengwa paintings. This is a good old antique of the mountain spirit with his leaf mantle echoing Dangun, and a very kind of Confucian retired official hat, a deer antler here, very Taoist, and the herbs and such up here. The pomegranate and a very crazy folk tiger, excellent example. Some of these mountain spirit paintings take on Buddhist characteristics, like with a very bald head. Looks more like a monk, a senior Buddhist master, just by being bald instead of having the Confucian top knot as an aspect. This is the old way, the very ancient old kind of mountain spirit shrines that are found at Korean temples. Still sometimes even stone carving simply before they ever started making. Mountain spirit shrines have been in Korean temples as far as we can tell right from the beginning. As soon as Buddhism was imported and they started putting it at the mountains, they often used old shamanistic sites where the mountain spirit was worshipped, took over that site, built a temple over it, and left the mountain spirit worship shrine at the back and still used it in this way, this shamanism, Taoism being incorporated. This is a great treasure from Hainsa Temple down the center, showing a very full-fledged Buddhist, including the naked, bulging belly of the Buddha of the future. This is essentially Sanchin, the mountain spirit, as a future Buddha coming in, riding on a mount in his cross-legged Buddhist way, riding on a tiger with his mount, and has even a Buddhist guardian figure with a sword next to him, extremely rare. This is a very full, and this painting is like 200 years old, and it's a very full integration, about as far as the Korean Buddhists ever got with this, of integrating the Sanchin as a kind of quasi-Buddhist figure. The Sanchin remains very powerful, very vibrant all over the country, and nearly ubiquitous, and as I say, about 90% of Buddhist temples have mountain spirit shrines, except some of the deep urban temples that are really just in the middle of the city, which are new ones, or a few temples that are ideologically influenced to clean out this kind of aspect and try to be pure international Buddhism, as said before. But the Sanchin and his shrines are still noticeably evolving together with Korean Buddhism. It's changing. It's not staying the same. There are new aspects, new icons, new kinds of shrines. This is a beautiful example of something a brand new. This is like 3 meters across. The original, bigger than it is here on the screen. Original painting, these new paintings at temples are bigger than they ever were historically. They cost a lot of money to have an artist commissioned to do this. And they're extremely rich. Look at all this background and such, much more than Buddhist paintings themselves, really. Naturalistic and rich, and with all this Taoist symbolism and such, and the tea making. Another good example of a modern one, simply with 2 tigers. That's out at Grandiose Island. And even female mountain spirits are making a comeback just about on the same time frame as we've had nuns. Female Buddhist monks have been returning to Korean Buddhism since, I believe, 1912, the first one. We started having women, and they were very subservient for most of the 20th century, but they've been becoming stronger in their roles, and Korean women, now there are some great Buddhist masters recognized who are women, and legions of female disciples, and many entire temples are now run by female monks. Their power is growing, they're getting closer to equality with the male monks, and at the same time female mountain spirit paintings appearing at the temples. I'm not sure you can synchronize that, but it's happening together with women's position all over Korea. Some of the new grandiose things that have been done, this 4-meter tall giant statue at a Buddhist that's kind of dominating the whole temple, statue of a mountain spirit, and then this shrine in front of it has 77 bronze statues of the mountain spirit lined along the wall, 77 of them, sacred number, holy number, and such. All through there, something very expensive to create, very elaborate, but temples are increasingly into this. And you find example things going on like this, a mountain spirit painting, the 2 tigers, male and female tiger, and on the female tiger, a bodhisattva, an unidentified bodhisattva, is standing there. Why, I do not know. I presume whatever the shaman Buddhist who is running this temple had a vision, had a dream of some sort of this, and had commissioned the artist to paint this way. It is unexplained. And even a mountain spirit painting done in silver on a monochrome background, the same way that Buddhist sutra illustrations were classically done. In the medieval times of Korean Buddhism, on pieces of silk, they would use gold or silver paint to do a monochrome thing showing the Buddha preaching and doing a mountain spirit painting in this way. Also, this is originally gigantic. And this great Buddhist monk, one of the senior monks of the country, very influential, down at Jirisan, at one of our greatest temples, built this reconstructed this hermitage himself, and inside the hermitage built the largest mountain spirit shrine that's ever been built in all of Korean history. And this was it opened 11 years ago. This is something new, and it spent just an amazing amount of money, I'm sure, $500,000 or so to construct this gigantic building, as big as the main hall of almost any temple, and such, just for the mountain spirit. Now this is the painting that's inside it. This painting is 6 meters across. It's like the whole of this wall. It's gigantic and amazingly expensive and amazingly elaborate. Of the mountain spirit, 2 tigers, and these bodhisattva figures who represent other peaks of the mountain. So again, a real blending of the Buddhist and Taoist, and Shamanic motifs within this, and this is the new trend. This is where it's going. This is not something historical. Now, we come to my second point. Okay, I spent way too long on the first one. I knew I would. But there it is. Now, that kind of lays the foundation before we go here. The second point being that Korean Buddhism is largely based in mountains. Now, part of this involves with the mountain spirit being in every temple. In fact, and these 2 factors kind of feed each other. The fact that there is a mountain spirit in each temple helps the whole kind of psychology of the Buddhism be oriented towards mountain culture, and the fact that the great temples are at the great holy sacred mountains of Korea make the factor that there is so many mountain spirit shrines, and they're so elaborate and so well tended to and such. A lot of the greatest temples in Korea, all the greatest temples of Korea really, are at the mountains, and often the greatest holy sacred mountains of the country. Now, this is different from China and Japan and other Buddhist countries, and certainly Thailand and such, largely due to historical accident, sort of, historical process. You go to, a lot of the greatest temples of Japan are right in the middle of a town or a city of some sort, and in China too, at least they used to be, great grand Buddhist temples right in the middle of cities and towns and such, and all other great temples off in the deep mountains. And Korea used to be like that, all for its first 1,000 years of Buddhism. There were great grand temples in the middle of the biggest cities and towns, and there were also great temples started in the mountains, although originally they were quite a bit smaller, the ones deep in the mountains. But history changed. Korea had a Confucian revolution. The Neo-Confucians made a military coup d'etat and took over the dynasty in a way that did not happen in any other country. Korea has the pride of the only Confucian revolution that ever happened. And the Confucians here got really radical, really fundamentalist. They drove the Buddhism out of the cities in a way that never happened in any other Buddhist countries. They shut down the temples, they confiscated the treasures, drove the monks out, and finally made it even illegal for a monk to enter the city. For hundreds of years, a monk could not even enter Seoul or Daegu or Busan, any of the big cities here, blocked at the gates. It was illegal. So the temples proliferated around Seoul in what is now the Bukhansan National Park and associated areas. Temples flourished there. Big people would come out of Seoul to go to the temple in the mountains, often at nighttime, to avoid scrutiny and such. And other temples in the deep mountains flourished because under the social oppression, they were kind of hiding back there in the very deep, very high mountains, supported just by local villagers. And this, hundreds of years ago, this seemed like a terrible oppression. And the Buddhists may have felt very sad to be in these deep, remote areas, far from civilization, where it's hard to make a living, and there's tigers all around us. Today, it seems like wonderful happiness and good fortune. The greatest temples of Korea are in what we now call national parks and provincial parks. This is the most beautiful, it's the best real estate in the whole country. It's land you couldn't buy if you were a millionaire, a billionaire, whatever. Wonderful locations, great stuff. By historical accident, everything turns around. But we end up with a Korean Buddhism where almost all of the great temples, as you can mention, are in deep mountain areas and very beautiful mountain areas and great valleys with waterfalls surrounded by pine trees, and so very focused, based on the mountains. It's focused on a mountain culture just by that historical process. One good example was everybody loves and such. Temples are built on a mountainside. There always a level after level that you climb up. Such from Bodhisattvas, the view from here is very famous. Just mountain ridges after ridges and such. Many tourists come to these temples just for the atmosphere, for the clean air, the good water, the views, the being in the mountains. This is an example from Gyeongju, where I'm now based, simply the Sokaram, which is very famous, but just a view of it, and a rather typical example of a deep mountain temple built very steeply, right up the side where you wouldn't even think there would be any civilization, but just built on levels up, very steep pathways up the mountains near the peaks. And this gives Korean Buddhism a real distinctive aspect of itself. So many of its best temples, hundreds and hundreds of them, are in places like this. Point 3, that rather orthodox, rather old-fashioned. The Korean Buddhists hold on to old-style practices and doctrines and beliefs in a very rather conservative way. And this is, some people think this is a characteristic of Korea altogether, of any Korean religion. Korean Christians are very noticeable for this too, that the kind of thing they got from America 100 years ago. They hold on to it fundamentally and are not much interested in modernizations. As I said, well, that's debatable. But there's a distinct strain within this of the Korean Buddhists these days. They have revived during the 20th century, and they hold very strongly. So the original practices of the kind of Buddhism that came here in the Tang Dynasty, in the Song Dynasty of China, so going back 1,000 years ago until 1,300 years ago or so, the original Zen Buddhism and the Huayan doctrines, Chungte doctrines, that developed in China at that time, that's what they still teach today. They still teach those fundamental sutras. They still do the same old kind of practices that were developed by the masters in those days, and they pride themselves on this. And the real serious meditation and study monasteries here in Korea, not the city temples and such, but those that are real serious about it in the deep mountains and such, that really have a very old-fashioned, conservative, orthodox character about it. Which is, now this factor is a contradiction to the first factor, that there's a lot of Taoism and Shamanism mixed into Korean Buddhism. And yeah, it's contradictory. It's kind of a yin-yang, if I may say. Koreans say yang, matching of complementary aspects. It's not a contradiction that destroys the system. It's a balancing and a fitting together of two different trends that make Korean Buddhism what it is. A lot of these things I'm showing here tonight are kind of like that. They're complementary factors of even though they're opposite from each other, but they kind of fit together to make a balanced and complex system out of it. Another factor, patriotic defender of the nation. Very distinct here. Koreans call this Hoguk Bulgyo. Hoguk Bulgyo, defending the nation Buddhism. So it's a strong trend. Ever since Buddhism first arrived here in the Three Kingdoms, the Buddhists held rituals to protect the nation from foreign invasion, to defeat foreign enemies, to make invasion successful, and to support the king. It was very state-supporting. This is you could regard it as a corruption of Buddhism. It's certainly against the general pacifistic traditions of Buddhism that we usually think of, that Buddhist monks should not kill anybody and such, but here you have Buddhist monks always praying for, holding rituals for the national defense. Korea has always been a small country. Korea has always had a very low population. Throughout most of history, Korea, the whole Korean peninsula had only 10% as many people as it did today. There was a lot of wilderness. Cities and towns were not that big. Korea had a small population and thus not much of a military, not much of an army, and was often seen as the victims of either the Manchurians, the Japanese, the Chinese, always threatened by invasion, and so a sense of needing protection, needing defense, needing a unity to protect themselves, and that the religion, the national religion of Buddhism, which was for 1,000 years, had to serve to defend the nation. In particular, during the Imjin-Weran, the great invasion by Japan 400 years ago, when Japanese samurai invaded Korea and ransacked it, these three became great heroes, Master Susan and his disciple Samyang and Master Yeongju. Together, each of them organized armies of monks, squadrons, or in Samyang's case, an entire army of monks to fight against the Japanese, and they were really quite successful compared to other Korean forces. The other great hero of that war, Admiral Lee Sun-shin, is a Confucian, and he's the guy on your 100 won coin, and he's very much memorialized everywhere in Korea, including in Gwanghwamun, a big statue. But besides him, these guys were the most successful Koreans fighting against the Japanese. And they are still very much there are multiple temples, which the main focus of the temple is memorializing one of these three, or all three of them, or certain others who are associated with that. And it's one of the great traditions of Korean Buddhism. And this really changed the whole reputation and character. This happened right in the middle, or in the end of the first third of the Joseon dynasty. which was, again, Neo-Confucian, and they were oppressing Buddhism, putting down Buddhism, kicking them out of the cities. And, you wouldn't think that the Buddhists would support the government in such a case. The Buddhists probably should have joined the Japanese in destroying the Joseon dynasty. Well, you think that might. The Japanese were Buddhists. Most of them, the samurai, had a Buddhist tendency, so, well, you think they might, but especially Master Susan was already 70 years old at this time, but came out of his mountain temple at 70 years old and led a whole squadron of monks to fight the Japanese up near, what's that, Heiju. He made the philosophical decision and communicated it to the other monks to say, we fight. We fight for our country. We fight to defend our country, and politics don't matter. Religious politics don't matter. We fight for Korea, and such. And that was very much appreciated afterwards. After the whole war was over, the Joseon dynasty really had to kind of step back, and a lot of the Joseon scholars had to admit, those Buddhists are real patriots. We've been putting them down, oppressing them for 200 years. They're not such bad guys, or maybe at least they're useful. They are patriotic. They are for the nation. And this has continued. There are still patriotic shrines, statues such as this for these guys. You can find all over the place. I don't know of any other country where this is quite so strong, this idea of that Buddhist monks and Buddhism, which is, again, supposed to be pacifistic, and Buddhist monks should not even kill a mosquito, but they can fight and kill the national enemies. Training with bow and arrow and spear, and these days with guns. These days Buddhist monks serve in the army, and Buddhist monks are army chaplains and such. And they're very strong as patriotic defenders of the nation. And this is one of the shrines, where these great Buddhist heroes are enshrined in there. The Joseon dynasty erected monuments for that. There's a modern, this is Master Samyang leading his army of monks down on the south coast to attack the Japanese and such. And these kind of shrines are all over to be found. Another characteristic, seeking harmony and unification. People have often called Korean Buddhism syncretic Buddhism, and that's a little too simplistic. But there has been a noticeable trend ever since around maybe 600 AD, some trend to try to find a unity of Buddhism. Already when Buddhism was strongly moving into Korea by, say, 400 to 500, and definitely by 600, there were many different Buddhist schools already. In China, whole different schools from India had come in and were contending against each other with contradictory philosophies, and the Chinese had already started after 500, the Chinese were making their own schools of Buddhism, which were quite different from the ones that originally came from India. We have the original Chinese Buddhist types, and especially Zen Buddhism growing up in China. And these were very contentious against each other, arguing that the real Buddhist truth, it's something like different kinds of Christianity, the historical battles between them, as well as politics being involved. And a noticeable trend within Korea ever since the 600s to try to seek a unity, a unification, a reconciliation that didn't really happen so much in China or in Japan, where there seemed to, for some reason, to let it be more that there can be different schools of Buddhism. They got their different opinions, and that's okay. You choose which one you want to join. And such. In Korea, more of a feeling, perhaps also because we're a small country, small population, all in the defense of always that we should be unified, should have a unified philosophy to it. Now this is Master Wonhyo, probably the most famous Korean Buddhist monk of all time, the greatest saint of Korean Buddhism. And that was his major trend. He was a genius philosophical scholar, and the main theme of his philosophical work during his life was to try to reconcile the different kinds of Buddhism coming from China and India and show that they all meant really the same thing, that they were all the product of the one Buddha mind. Come from them, and they all lead back to that one Buddha mind enlightenment, trying to reconcile those. And his work in this was so important, it influenced China and Japan quite a bit. His documents for hundreds of years after his death, the things that he wrote influenced the development of Buddhism in those neighboring countries towards this idea of reconciling, which was never really accomplished in those countries, it was here, but the different kinds of scholastic doctrinal Buddhism, along with the Zen meditative Buddhism, always in Korea, a tendency to try to reconcile and unite. And this went on for hundreds of years, right? Into the Goryeo dynasty, often the royalty got involved. The government, the king, pressed Buddhist schools to unite, sometimes literally forced them to, like the different doctrinal schools, to unite together into one doctrinal school. No matter you hate each other and don't agree with each other, but you must be one school. And the meditative schools put them together. And at sometimes later with the Joseon dynasty, even just trying to make one Buddhism, trying to force them together. This idea, but there are plenty of incentive from the Buddhist monks themselves trying to find this reconciliation and unity. And then, seventh point, that they actually got it to a remarkable extent, and to more than any other Buddhist country that there is, more even than the Tibetans, to a greater extent, that there actually came to be a Korean Buddhism, a fairly well unified national Buddhism. Today, the Jogye order of Korean Buddhism is something roughly like about 70% maybe of the monks and the temples and such as one order, and has a fairly coherent system of doctrines and practices which run together. They started in 800 years ago, 1200 AD, this master, Jinul, Master Bojo Jinul, kind of a religious genius, was able to bring together the various doctrinal schools and the meditative schools. Meditative, I mean Zen Buddhism, that's focused entirely on meditation, doesn't study any scriptures. The doctrinal schools are entirely focused on study and understanding. He brought those together, and then before he died was appointed national master by the king to recognize that his way was officially approved. And there were some bumps along the road, and there's divisions and reconciliations later on. But for 800 years, there has been a coherent system that we now call the Jogye order of Korean Buddhism. Master Taego also reconciled between the meditative Buddhism and more devotional types of Buddhism. The devotional of chanting, bowing, praying, wishing for things, which is another strong trend in Buddhism, popular with the common people. He made a reconciliation with that, and then together they're both recognized as great foundational masters by the Jogye order. As I said, the Jogye order is that they're the ones with the national headquarters temple that's really close to here, and right over there, 100 meters away from us, the national headquarters of Korean Buddhism. That's the Jogye order, who can fairly well claim to represent Korean Buddhism. The second biggest order, the Taego order of Korean Buddhism, are very significant, but they're not really much different. The major difference they have is that monks can get married if they want to. They can get married and have a family, where the Jogye order monks are celibate. This is a practical difference, but not really about doctrine. Not really significant. The things that the Taego order believes, and that they trace back to these masters and their achievements, they're named after Master Taego himself, they believe roughly the same stuff as what the Jogye order believes. It's a historical thing, a historical division where they became enemies and divided, and particularly on the issue of marriage of monks and about property ownership of temples, but not a doctrine, not a real belief or practical difference. And so the two biggest orders, they basically believe kind of the same thing. It's a bit like what the Anglicans and the Catholics attempting to reconcile. The British Church. And so they're really not very far apart in belief, but just more in practical matters and such. So there is really a unified Buddhism. More than other countries have, 20%, 30% at best in one faction. Even the famous Tibetan Buddhism is divided between different types of Lamaism, the yellow hats and the red hats, which can be quite different for each other and who murder each other at a fair rate in the last few hundred years. But a conflict. Korea is the most unified country that I know of as far as having a representative national Buddhism. Even the other smaller orders, the third biggest order of Korean Buddhism, the Chunje order, they're fairly distinctively different in doctrine and practice than the first two. But then the others below them, the many, many smaller Buddhist orders, are mainly, again, divided from the Jogye order just out of factionalism for personal reasons, financial reasons, things that I'm not really believing something very different from all that. There is a sense of that there is a one representative national Korean Buddhism, with only a few outliers. And something distinctive here, there's a distinctive trend that kind of runs counter, again, in a yin-yang kind of way, to the orthodoxy and the seriousness of the doctrinal and meditative Buddhism, the popular devotional Buddhism that is directed towards Bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas that are supposed to be symbols of aspects of enlightenment that we aspire to, but are generally used by the common Buddhist believers of Korea to pray to the Bodhisattvas to get worldly benefits, which is actually then a kind of shamanism, that's what shamanism is about, that you pray to spirits to get better health, or for your son to pass the national exam, or to give birth to a son entirely, or to have your daughter marry a rich guy, or to get yourself a Cadillac car. Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? These classical things of real world benefits. That's shamanism, and Koreans are very strong within the Buddhist laity of prayer to these bodhisattva figures in order to get that, which is again leading back to the shamanistic aspects, and been very much tolerated and even encouraged by the monks, and there's a fair amount of money it's made from. I put this particular photo on here. This is right here in Seoul. In one sense, a good example of this, because this is a carving, a 1,000-year-old carving, that scholars, such as myself, are pretty much in agreement that this is the Amita Buddha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise. But the temple itself keeps claiming that it's Wanzam Bosal, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who is a very popular figure among the laity and makes all kinds of money with 24-hour worship by people and such up there. And they keep claiming that it is Wanzam Bosal against all the scholars, and they have it labeled on signs as such, even though the government would disagree, and therefore this is a really great carving, but it's not listed as a national treasure due to that dispute, but it's because of the importance of the Bodhisattva belief, that the temple really wants this to be a Bodhisattva. I don't care what the damn scholars say. Anyway, finally, my final one here, stone pagodas, which certainly other countries have some of, but that is stupas. Stupas developed in India, brick structures laid over with earth and plaster and such to contain the relics of Buddhist figures, and then educational institutions for Buddhism were built around the stupas in India. As is moved across the Silk Road into China, they started making cave temples, and also in China they built brick towers and then wooden towers on top of that, and started building multi-story towers, at first 4 stories tall, later 8 stories tall, and sometimes 10 brick or wooden towers, and they use those as study centers, as they're kind of the original skyscrapers of East Asia. Korea built a 9-story tower in the 600s in Gyeongju, which was the highest building in all of Northeast Asia for several hundred years, until the Mongols sacked and burned it. Now, but Korea started its own kind of distinctive tradition of these wooden, stone, carved out of Korean granite, which is so plentiful, so common, ubiquitous. The whole peninsula is made out of this stuff, but is a really excellent construction material. It's very hard to carve and fashion, but once you make something out of it, it sits out here outdoors for 1,400 years undamaged. It does not care about the weather and the seasons. Really good material. The Koreans, out of this granite, most of that granite, started making very large, distinctive pagoda figures as the centerpiece of temples, the center of worship. These are not buildings. Most of them that were built, Koreans only built a few of the Chinese-style towers in history, and today only a very few of those remain in any form. Mostly they built these just as reliquaries to hold the relics in their sacred relics of sutras or relics of great monks or of the Buddha himself. In this case, twins here. This is the Gyeongju twin ones, and they're gigantic in size, the biggest ever built in the Shilla kingdom. A human being barely stands up to the base of this, and such a very large, monumental, very distinctive. Other countries don't have this, and this goes even with the other example, the great, by the Goryeo dynasty, about medieval times, the great 9-story and 8-sided. It's very distinctive with the Korean pagodas that they use odd numbers in their stories. The Chinese, who we got this idea from China, but the Chinese always use even numbers. It's 4, 6, 8, 10, maybe 12. Koreans always built their pagodas 3, and then 5, 7, 9. And occasionally 11 or 13, never, almost never an even number of stories. It's from Korean Shamanism, where the odd numbers are sacred and holy, and the even numbers are profane. Just quite different from China, different from Chinese culture. It makes something very distinctive for Korea. This is one of the great national treasures, 9-story high with 8 sides on there representing the 8 full noble path of Buddhist doctrine. This has been copied many times around the country. Many temples now sport a new, larger version of this one. Dosunsa here in North Seoul built one just last year, and 3 years ago the Jogesa, the national headquarters temple, built one like this, of this motif. It's right over there, 100 yards from us right now. The most famous stone pagodas in all of Korea, that you've certainly all seen before, the Tabo Top, which is on your 10-won coin, the only Buddhist symbol on Korean money, the only symbol at all on Korean money which is not from the early Joseon dynasty. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, or ever thought about it. Every single thing on Korean money, every person, every motif, every symbol is from 1392 to 1592. Those 200 years, exactly. Out of the whole 2,000 years of Korean history, those 200 years are represented on the money entirely, except one thing on the lowest, cheapest coin, the 10-won coin, the Tabo Tao, representing the entire rest of Korean history, and the only Buddhist symbol on Korean money. That's a whole another lecture in itself. But the Tabo Tao and the Sukha Tao, the two twinned ideas, maybe the greatest achievement of Korea pagoda construction as a yin-yang, male-female, earth and heaven kind of duality there. And some of our very greatest national treasures. Now, together with this stone pagodas idea, then the ubiquitous doltap, the small pagodas made out of stones, piled rocks, that in every hiking area, every mountain area, just on stream beds, you'll find them everywhere. Koreans make them just out of instinct, just out of habit, it seems. Most Koreans can't even tell you why they're building the thing, but they all build them whenever they get the chance, whenever there's stones laying around. These things, they're called doltaps, stone pagodas. And again, it's a shamanistic thing, a nature shamanistic thing that blends in with the Buddhist beliefs and is strongly connected. Okay, summary, these are the 8 factors that I have introduced to you. Okay, so they're connected to each other in various different ways. See the connections between them. Some of them are kind of contradictory and balance against each other. Others are a more straight feedback connection. And just to bring up some questions as we conclude and open to your questions, but just to ask, what role might these factors play then as we consider international Buddhist opinion of and desire to participate and practice with major Korean Buddhist orders? Everything is more globalized these days. Korean Buddhism has got 100 centers all over the world, and many foreign Buddhists come here, and these distinctively Korean aspects, will these be attractive to other international Buddhists? Will they find it a barrier to participation or something attractive? Will there more want or more easy to integrate foreign participation? What role can this play in the Green Korea ecological movement? And let's throw in the well-being, healthy living movement. The fact that Korean Buddhists are in the mountains, or the mountain temple thing has been very attractive in this, the TempleStay program. A lot of people go there and don't care anything about religion or spiritual practice, but just go there for their health, just to enjoy the healthy living in the mountains, the vegetarian food, the good, fresh, clean water, etc. And the Green Korea idea of preserving nature, the Korean Buddhism is so integrated into the mountain areas and serves as a factor in their preservation. And the 21st century revival and appreciation for Korea's traditional spiritual culture, which is something I've been feeling coming on. Back in the 1980s, nobody seemed to care very much about anything traditional, except for very few practitioners. But today there's a much more widespread appreciation that we have a national spiritual culture, and Buddhism has got to be certainly a strong part of that. And a more religious pilgrimage tourism sector, which is something what I work on exactly, but surely with the TempleStay movement, and again the tendency to play up and perhaps exaggerate Korea's particular aspects, the characteristics, but then these can be attractive to actually the idea that Korean Buddhism is different from its neighbors. Come and see Korean Buddhism. Even if you've already seen Chinese Buddhism, come and see ours. We got something different for you. Okay, there's that factor. Modern developments of enhanced conceptions of Korea's national identity and international image branding, something the previous government was very concerned about, and is perhaps now just this whole idea of Korea as a brand, a national brand. Not much Buddhism has been brought into that so far. Not much in those listings and everything. You can see the government efforts, but they're beginning to bring in more of that, and more of the Buddhist treasures, more of the Buddhist practices, ritual practices, and the identity and the successful TempleStay program, that's beginning to be brought in more as a factor in showing Korea to the world as branding something distinctively as Korean as kimchi. And the last one in there was national unification. North Korea has temples. They don't have monks anymore. They all got killed or driven out. They don't have any Buddhism. They fake it sometimes, but they don't really. They fake it for visitors and such. But can Buddhism be a factor in this sense of one Korean nation, one Korean national identity, who we are as a people that should be one nation and shouldn't be two governments? Well, why? One ethnic group. Well, Buddhism, it seems, with this great history, would be part of that, and the distinctive Korean aspects, in particular things like the mountain spirit and the Taoist shamanic aspects, which are widely shared among the Korean people, seems like could play a role in that, and probably will in the future. For your information, please, my website is like 400 pages of associated issues, especially the mountain spirit stuff and holy mountain, sacred mountain stuff about this. And then the book that we were supposed to be showing to you tonight and promoting with this speech, but has been delayed probably until September. Publishing problems, publisher problems, and I regret. But if you people watch on this website, when this is published, this should be kind of a landmark effort. It's the first time this has been done. And it's been authorized by the major Buddhist university, Dongguk University, and the Jogye Order of Korean Buddhism. They're supporting this. They have finally a real encyclopedia on Korean Buddhism in English to explain all the vocabulary and all the history and the practices of people in an official way. Get this in English. I spent all last year writing this, and I hope it comes out. Someday, we're waiting. They're putting in the illustrations now. So, okay, keep a watch. If you're interested in this whole subject, keep a watch for this. And maybe by September it will be on sale. That's it.
Thank you very much. We still have time. We have the room till 9:30. So, a few questions. If you have energy for questions. Loud voice and the messages.
Sir?
Have you noticed the power shift in between the Christian and Korean, the Christian and Buddhist sects in Korea now that with the ascension of I think a Buddhist, right, to power?
Okay, first of all, I don't believe she's officially a Buddhist. I've heard people claim that she's a Christian convert.
The Dongguk University people claim her as a...
Yeah, but some Buddhists claim that. During her campaign, she said nothing clear about that at all, and made no obvious indication that she is a Buddhist. She does not know religion. She said she has no religion. Yeah, she said no religion. Okay, that makes sense to me. I've heard some claim she was converted to Christianity at some point in her history, but again, she's made absolutely, she does not wear a cross, and that's nothing about that. Her mother was a Buddhist saint. Regarded as a Buddhist saint. Her mother is enshrined at Dosunza Temple, and such was regarded. Her father, Park Chung-hee, of course, had no religion. His religion was national development. That was his religion. Well, some people it is, and that's understandable. He was not what we would call a spiritual man, but his wife was a Buddhist, and she did a whole lot with her husband, whispering in her husband's ear to get Korean Buddhism revived, getting her husband to reconstruct a lot of the great temples of the nation and build highways to them and expressway exits and giant parking lots and such, and turn our greatest temples into places where all Koreans could visit and the international community. Her father did a lot of that. And so she is associated in the public mind with Buddhism, let's say that. But she has declared no religious preference at all, and I would be surprised if she does anything factional. Our previous president, as everybody knows, was a Protestant, a hard-line fundamentalist, and enthusiastic Protestant. So was Kim Il-sung before him. In between them, Kim Dae-jung was Catholic, and Marxist or something, I don't know. Not a religion. Okay, so now, to answer the question, no, I don't see any change at all happening because she became president. Again, because of her neutrality, and I'm not expecting one. However, in general, it seems to me that the great power of Korean Christianity, which has been so strong, so influential in the government and in society, I had the feeling it kind of peaked about 10 years ago. It kind of got about as strong as it could get. And there's been a bit of a fall off, or at least a leveling off, of the growth and power of the Protestant Christians. And Korean Buddhism continues a kind of a climb. It's attracting some young people, and it's getting some juice as a national spirituality. And so I think it's got some legs behind it. And yeah, you may see more of a tight competitiveness between them, I would say.
I heard from non-Korean Buddhists, especially the Hyungak-nim, your book, right? Said that the Jeol is one of the unique. He wrote that Jeol is one of the unique Korean Buddhist things. Although I know that Tibetans do something similar, but in a Jeol, what's called a prostration, you do like a 백팔배, and then it goes 300배, 500배, 1000배, 3000배, odd numbers, right?
Yeah,
right.
Bowing.
Yeah, bowing. That's right, bowing. And I tend to agree with them, and I don't know why that was missed out of the Korean business. And another thing I thought was that maybe the strong Zen practice that's been coming down based on the lineage in Korean Buddhism. Although secular Buddhism is a little different, just like praying for secular lux and charms and etc. But among the Buddhist monks, I mean, most of them they risk their lives to get to enlightenment via really strict Zen practice, and I think that's another strong part of the Korean Buddhism. I wonder why that wasn't there.
Well, I would say the Jeol practice with the bowing was something I had not really considered. I think that it's fairly common in other countries with Buddhism. Perhaps not the way the Koreans do it, perhaps, but still bowing and chanting practices, chanting while bowing, is a pretty common thing in Buddhism around the world. And I'll consider that. I'll consider that for upgrading my list if there is something I can find that's really uniquely Korean about that.
More
Now,
talking than bowing. These days, for instance, if you are Korean Buddhist, you don't bow, something wrong about you.
well, okay.
Yeah.
It's a strong practice here, no doubt. Now, with the Zen, the strong, strict central core of Zen Buddhism in there, I did intend to cover that in my point number 3 of the orthodox practices from the Tang Dynasty.
Yeah.
Really, yes, the original Zen, the Matsu line coming from Huining, which came from Bodhidharma. They really trace an orthodox legacy of Zen. And they're very concerned with the teacher-to-teacher transmission and such, and that very orthodox character. That is part of my, I should have made that more clear as part of my number 3. Sir?
You characterize Sun Cho's efforts at universalizing Korean Zen as having been something of a failure. And I have, in that regard, I have 2 related, they're oddly related in some of the way you describe some elements of Korean Buddhism as being oddly related. One is, in many ways, I think Sun Cho's spiritual successor is Subusu. And he has been leading an extremely dynamic and by their own accounts, extremely successful effort at introducing a kind of popular Sufism in Korean Buddhism, or popular sudden enlightenment practice.
Yeah.
So I just wonder how you factor that into your assessment of Sun Cho's legacy. And at the same time, I wonder what you have to say about Minjung Buddhism.
Well, first of all, with Sun Cho, I wasn't really focused on his advocacy of a sudden enlightenment practice versus the gradual enlightenment of the previous Jogye order. And this is very much a dynamic argument that is still going on within Korean Buddhism. It's something that makes Korean Buddhism very vital, very alive, but they haven't really decided all the questions yet. And that there are those within the mainstream Jogye order who believe in and propagate the idea of intensive practice leading to one single sudden enlightenment, and then others going with Master Bojo Jinul, who 800 years ago developed the kind of compromise between doctrine and Zen and a system of gradual enlightenment. And both streams are still going very strong within the one Jogye order here, and they argue with each other and fight, but that hasn't caused them to schism yet, and I hope it doesn't. I hope they're able to reconcile this. My thing about Master Sun Cho is more how he was, for those of you who don't know, Master Sun Cho, he died in 1993, and many people called him the living Buddha of Korea. And there are other great masters who were certainly equal to him, I'm sure, but he had a big public following and was very well known, very famous. He was the national patriarch of Korean Buddhism twice, served 2 terms as national patriarch, and was a very popular, well-known figure, kind of a genius, a guy who studied all kinds of science and philosophy and Western stuff, and then tried to integrate it with Buddhist theory, and gave great public lectures, very intellectual and such, but also was a very strict, very heavy, old-fashioned Zen master who made his students just sit and don't get up, and really old-fashioned and orthodox, that led many disciples to enlightenment by doing this, and himself was considered very grandly enlightened. But he had this real campaign against the Taoist and Buddhist stuff. And in particular, my main study has been the Sanchin, the mountain spirit, and Sun Cho was the great enemy of the mountain spirit. In particular, he ordered all the monks, and when he was national patriarch, he put out an order to tear down those shrines, take out those paintings, and burn them. And a lot of these paintings are great treasures, great antiques of Korean folk art. This would have been tragic if he had been obeyed. Mostly, he himself, in the late 1980s, at his main temple, Heiinsa, Gaya-san Heiinsa, where he spent most of the last part of his life, he went to the main shrine there. He took out the paintings of the mountain spirit and also the Yongwan, the Dragon King, took him to the middle of the courtyard, assembled hundreds of monks around him, lit him on fire. burned them and said, "This must be done in temples around." Fortunately, I photographed those paintings before he could burn them, and they are featured in my book, Spirit of the Mountains, reproductions of this. I say this. Now, he ordered this happen all over the place, and even at his own temple in Hainfa, in the hermitages around there, mostly they did it really Korean style. The monks just took down the paintings out of the shrine and like hid them inside the walls, inside the bamboo walls, or behind the altar, or behind somebody's bedchamber, something like that. Just hid the paintings. After Master Songchul died, the paintings started coming out again. The mountain spirit came back. So I put this in my book, kind of a case where the greatest, at that time, the greatest living master of Korean Buddhism, that he made an enemy of the mountain spirit and took out and tried to destroy the mountain spirit, but the mountain spirit won. Still 90% of temples around Korea still enshrine the mountain spirit. He was largely disobeyed nationwide on this question. It's something too strong for even a great master to oppose. This was my point, and it's one of my great examples. Because I put this in my book, for a while I was persona non grata at Hainfa, as it was controlled by Master Songchul's disciples after his death. They made it known for about a decade that I was not welcome at their temple, just because I said that Songchul failed at something. According to them, he could never possibly fail at anything. Impossible, because he was a Buddha. So, religion. So, but this is kind of as an example of these tensions between these things.
That's true.
So in your role of developing Korean tourism, or Buddhist tourism, TempleStay stuff, who do you see as who's the main draw? Is it domestic tourism? Is it tourism from other Asian nations, or is it more Western, or just a collusion of all three? Who's coming?
It has changed very much. It became, as with most great and successful things, it became something quite different from what we intended. The very first idea of it was just for extra housing during the World Cup. They're worried we didn't have enough hotels. They wanted to let World Cup visitors stay at some of the Buddhist temples around the cities that were holding World Cup events. And the Jogye Order of Korean Buddhism was imagining having drunken soccer hooligans, from Australia or Scotland or something, staying in their temple, burning it down. And they said, no way. So my committee of Visit Korea year, we kind of reconfigured the pitch of the program, putting it to them as a missionary opportunity, that people could say that they could control it, and they could make people wear Buddhist clothing and behave properly and decently, and they could kind of pitch Korean Buddhism to the foreigners who were attending the World Cup. And they went for that, finally, rather grudgingly, but they finally accepted it. And in April 2002, we had the very first TempleStay program at Chikjisa. And we invited the ambassadors from all the foreign countries to Korea to come be there. And I was the guide, the explainer of it. And that went very well during the World Cup and after the World Cup. It was a thing then really for Western tourists, because it was offered just in English at first. So it's for the Westerners and such, and to show a proud part of Korean culture, and to get people into the national parks, because otherwise difficult to get them to visit the national parks where there's only rough motels. But if you let them sleep in a Buddhist temple and they're roughing it for a religious reason, then people think it's pretty cool. And later, then after 2004, the government actually ended its program of doing this and turned it over to the Jogye Order. They just gave it to them and said, okay, you run this. And the Jogye Order took off with it, and it started attracting surprising numbers of domestic tourists. They started offering TempleStay programs in Korean for the Koreans, and that by now dwarfs, it's 10 times more than the foreigners' participation. Koreans really got into this because of the well-being movement and the city stress, the idea of stressed out people in the city, and go spend the weekend even with your family at a temple with vegetarian food, the pine trees and the water, and do some meditation, bohemian lifestyle thing. And then it has expanded to visitors from other countries, other languages have been involved. The Chinese are not really into it yet. They're still just into shopping for cosmetics here in Korea, but I think there's a great potential. The Chinese will be interested in the TempleStay program because of the cultural similarity and something they can't do in China, can't access in China anymore, but something very authentic and rich for them here. Can be.
Last question. question. One last.
What does it mean that in North Korean Buddhism they use Sanskrit for chanting? Is that a recent thing, like post-division, or is that...
In North Korean Buddhism, they use Sanskrit for
When they took us to a temple in Myohyang-san in 2010 in North Korea, this is what we were told.
I don't know. As far as I know, there's no authentic Buddhism in North Korea. There's no actual religious believers. The government puts on shows for foreigners sometimes with people who are just, as often happens in China these days too, guys that are just dressed up in Buddhist robes, but they're just government officials. If they're using Sanskrit, I have no idea why they would do that, or maybe because they have no idea of authentic Buddhism, Korean Buddhism.
Chanting Sanskrit here.
Lost it. And yeah, some of it, like the Om Mare Padre, sort of the thing. That some parts of Korean Buddhist chants are from Sanskrit and never translated, so they're just sounds to the Koreans that are left that way. That's been done, and it's still done sometimes here in the temples, but small parts.
Okay, we end there. Once more, applause.